Hello, everyone. A very good evening. I am Jhumpa Mukherjee, Brand and Media Manager at Minimac Systems. Welcome you all for the most awaited and important topic, how to combat water contamination and foam formation in lubrication systems. To discuss this important topic, we have in the panel Mr. Anshuman Agrawal, founder and managing director of Minimac Systems, and Mr. Rafe Britton, who is a technical consultant and the host of Lubrication Explained YouTube channel. So the flow of today's webinar will be a presentation by our experts, followed by AMA session, that is a Q&A session of 30 minutes, which will be conducted by my colleague, Supreme Ranjan today. And just a reminder to drop your queries and questions in Q&A box, not in the chat box. In chat box, we might miss some important ones. Without any further delay, I will hand over the stage to Mr. Anshuman. Over to you, sir.
Hi, thank you so much, Jhumpa, for handing over the stage to me. And thank you so much, organizers, for reorganizing this beautiful webinar on the favorite topic of foam formation and moisture control in lubrication systems. May I request Rafe to please share the presentation? Thank you so much. So the topic for today is how to combat water contamination and foam formation in lubrication systems, which is a very, very important topic and an interesting one as well. A lot of us who are professionals in lubrication systems have already faced problems related to foam formation in our lubrication system tanks. And we have also compiled certain industrial problems from various industrial sectors where foam formation and water contamination have led to severe conditions or severe situations where the plant had to be shut down. A lot of important parts had to be changed, replaced, and in certain cases, to an extent that the lubrication oil also had to be replaced completely. To set the stage for Rafe, who is an expert on this topic, I would like to sensitize the audience with some of the cases which we have come across. And I'm sure most of you would also have experienced certain cases of foam formation in your lubrication systems already. Yeah, the next slide. So the first case problem we have encountered in a thermal power plant, which is having 2600 megawatt capacity. The problem which was identified out there was severe erosion in the turbine's rotor and the journal portion that sit over the bearing. It was actually eaten up very badly because of contamination. And due to this problem, the turbine had to be shut down. It was a 110 megawatt turbine unit, and it had to be shut down. And the cost incurred to the company was around 25 to 30 CR, just because of this problem. The next case we have is from a refinery, and this refinery was having equipment like the wet gas compressor, and the wet gas compressor was tripping very frequently. The main reason behind it was there were seal and gland failures happening. There was a lot of axial vibration, and the suction knockout of the drum had been observed out there. The key reason behind all these problems was foam formation in the lubrication system, which was actually diagnosed over the period of time. The third case is from a steel plant. And in a steel plant, there are large-sized lubrication system tanks in an integrated steel plant. And these are centralized lubrication systems. So they have tanks up to a capacity of 40,000 liters, 50,000 liters. And these tanks are actually partitioned by baffle systems inside the tank. And because of foam formation, what was happening in this particular case, the oil was not able to reach the suction side of the pump. So there are two parts in a tank which are baffled by an intermediate baffle. So the oil was quite high in level on the return side of the tank, but on the suction side of the pump, the oil was getting starved. And this was happening because of foam formation and many other associated contaminants in the lubrication system. So in order to find out the answers around such case problems, I would like to invite my friend Rafe Bitton, who has actually given his valuable time. And he is based out of Australia, so I'm sure it's already late night out there. But he was kind enough to give his time to share his experiences, his learnings, and his findings around foam formation in lubrication systems. So over to you, Rafe. Thank you so much for joining us out here today for the webinar.
All right. Thank you for the introduction from Anjuman, as well as the rest of the Minimac team. For everyone who is re-attending this webinar, thanks so much for your patience. I know the last time round was a little bit difficult, but we'll get it right this time. So as Anshuman said, what we're going to do is sort of address, what is effectively two different types of contamination problems. We're going to talk about water ingress as well as air ingress. Now, sometimes we might not think of air as necessarily being a contaminant because it's all around us. It's just part of natural life. But in fact, when you think about it, air is really, along with water, the most common contaminant in our oil systems because there's no getting away from it. So we want to discuss today a little bit about, how does air and water get into oil systems? How are the ways that we can also remove it from our oil systems, and what are some of the negative consequences of having both water and air contamination? And they are somewhat related, so we'll try and draw parallels between the two when we can. Now, as I said last time around, I'm going to try and keep an eye on the Q&A box. So if you do have questions as we're going along, I'll try and address them as we are on that slide. Otherwise, we'll obviously get to it in the Ask Me Anything session at the end. So what we'd ideally like to talk about today is, in terms of the agenda, we'll talk about types of water in oil systems, the negative effects of water, water removal methods, and then move on to types of air in oil systems. Talk a little bit about the physics of air in oil. There's some misunderstandings as well about sort of the nature of foam and when does foam get worse versus when is it not so much of a problem. So we'll talk a bit about that. The negative effects of air in oil systems, as well as strategies for controlling air in oil systems. Okay. So let's first off start with the types of water in oil, just so that we all have a bit of a kind of an understanding. So first of all, there are kind of four types of water in oil. The first is dissolved water. This is water that's not necessarily apparent, right? You can't see it. There's no droplets or anything like that. It's just within the bulk of the lubricant. Now, that kind of water isn't all that dangerous, to be honest. And sort of as a general rule of thumb, when we want to know like how much dissolved water is okay, the general rule of thumb that's given is often if you take an oil sample in a clear bottle and you place a newspaper behind it, you should be able to roughly read the newspaper. So as the water content gets higher, the oil system tends to get a little bit more cloudy to the point where eventually you won't be able to read the newspaper. That's kind of like a general rule of thumb that I use. Okay, the second type of water that we have is free water. So this is when the oil and the water have completely separated out, and it will be very obvious, right? It's either there'll be a little bubble of water at the bottom of your sample, or it'll be a layer that has completely separated out. So free water, typically will sit at the bottom of our oil systems, but we know that that's because of the differences in the density, right? So free water, water has a specific gravity of 1. Mineral oils in the ballpark of, let's say, 0.86 to 0.9 or something like that. But of course, there are exceptions to this rule, right? If you're using a polyalkylene glycol, which is very common in, for example, gas compressors or even worm drives, like for gearboxes, that has a specific gravity which is higher than water. And so the water will actually sit on top of the oil. Polyol esters, which are very common in the jet oils, have a specific gravity which is almost exactly 1. And so it's not obvious how the water would necessarily separate out. The third type of water is emulsified. So generally what you can think of emulsified water as being a kind of like a dispersion of micro droplets of water, which are mixed in. And generally how it presents itself is kind of like that milky appearance. And we'll talk a little bit more about emulsions as well. Okay, so they're sort of the three general types of water that you'll encounter. Now, you should probably be familiar with this saying that oil and water cannot mix, right? This is something that my grandfather used to say to me all the time, but he was talking about girls I dated, saying that there were certain girls that were not right for me. But oil and water cannot mix is kind of like a universally understood expression. But the fact is that there are many oil and water mixes that we encounter on a day-to-day basis, and we may not even think about it. So butter, for example, is an oil and water emulsion, right? It's a mix of animal fats, which are oils, as well as some water. Same goes for milk, right? Milk is an oil and water emulsion where the two are mixed together. So let's think about why is it that water and oil generally don't mix, and then we'll talk about the cases in which they do mix. Okay, so why don't water and oil mix? Fundamentally, it's because they're dissimilar molecules. So water, for example, is highly polar and can form hydrogen bonds. So if you were to look at it, the hydrogens are generally what we would say positively charged, and the oxygens are negatively charged. Whereas most oil molecules, and this is very true for the paraffinics, especially for synthetic polyalpha olefins, because they're straight chain mixes of carbon and hydrogen, they don't really have any net charge to them. So as a result, it's not necessarily that the oil wants to separate out from the water, in so much as the water wants to stick to itself, because all the negative charges want to line up with the positive charges, right? We know that the opposites attract. So if all the water wants to coalesce and come together, it's kind of going to exclude all the oil. And that's why we get that separation of water and oil. It's all got to do with differences in polarity. Now, that should immediately trigger something in our mind, because we know that not all oil systems are non-polar, right? So esters, for example, are quite polar. Polyalkylene glycols are even more polar than that. And so they tend to mix with water differently. So I'm going to start with our first poll question. Right? And the poll question, first up, how much dissolved water is normal in a mineral oil system? And the options I'm going to give you is 1, 0 to 100 parts per million, 2, 100 to 1,000 parts per million, 3, 1,000 to 10,000 parts per million, or 4, 10,000 to 100,000 parts per million. And I'll just briefly wait for your responses. All right, 0 to 100 was the most common answer, which is really interesting. So in my experience of testing most oil systems, I tend to find that 100 to 1,000 is pretty normal. And that's because in mineral oils, especially the group 1s, there is a certain amount of polarity. And so they naturally tend to pull some water out of the air, right? So they're what we would call hygroscopic. As a result, there is a certain amount of dissolved water in the oil. Now, what's interesting about this is that the answer varies depending on the oil condition as well, right? So we know that, for example, a new oil will tend to take on less water as an older, aged oil. So through the aging process, as an oil oxidizes, it becomes more polar, and therefore that increases its affinity for water. So, oxidized oils tend to take on more water. Now, the other thing I should kind of point out about this question was that I was very specific in saying how much dissolved water is normal for a mineral oil system. So as we go to something like an ester, right, higher levels of water are, undesirable in an ester, but normal. And a polyalkylene glycol, in some cases, I've seen 10,000 parts per million water, and that's perfectly normal because the PAGs tend to take on a lot of water from the atmosphere. All right, so that's kind of like the dissolved water piece. Now let's talk a little bit about how emulsions form as well. So let's say, for example, you will have encountered probably mayonnaise at some point. Mayonnaise is yet another oil and water emulsion. So the two main ingredients of mayonnaise are vegetable oil, usually, and water. And how do you make it? If you've ever made mayonnaise from scratch, it's actually an exercise in mixing oil and water, and we beat it together, we whisk it together with an egg. So, why is the egg, aside from taste, right? Why is that crucial to the process? Well, the actual key part of the egg, which is helping to bind the oil and the water together, is this molecule, which you'll be very familiar with because this is actually a cholesterol molecule, right? So obviously cholesterol is supposed to be very bad for you, bad for the heart, etc. But what we're interested in here is its characteristics and how it wants to bind with both water and oil. And the reason it can do that is because, a cholesterol, being an alcohol, has a polar functional group at one end, and then this long kind of oily tail. So we have a segment, all the stuff in gray wants to bind to oil, and the red bit, which is the oxygen, wants to bind to water. So if we have a cholesterol molecule in an oil and water system, right, the head of the cholesterol molecule is going to want to bind to the water. The tail is going to want to bind to the oil, and it can then hold that micro droplet in suspension. And if we have enough of these dispersed throughout, then we can create a stable emulsion. Now, what are the problems with having water in your oil system? Well, one is viscosity control, right? Usually you would think that if you mix two things, that the mixture would have a viscosity which is the average of the two components, right? So vegetable oil is quite thin, water is quite thin. Theoretically, mayonnaise should also be thin. But of course, what we know is that mayonnaise is substantially thicker in viscosity, right? In the order of about 6,000 centistokes. I have no idea who actually measured mayonnaise in a viscometer, but apparently it's been done, right? So 6,000 centistokes is vastly higher than either vegetable oil or water. And that can be problematic, right? If we create these emulsions, it takes so much more energy to pump that oil around our system. Maybe we run into oil starvation problems because our pump is not able to generate enough pressure to get a significant enough amount of head through all our supply lines, right? So that can be a huge problem. Not only that, but we're wasting energy. And as we waste energy, we increase the amount of heat, and heat obviously leads to oxidation. So generally, emulsions are hugely undesirable. Oh, sorry, I had a question come through, which is hydrolysis. What is hydrolysis? We are going to get to that question in a later slide. So, Mohammed, if you wouldn't mind just holding on for a second. All right. Then we have viscosity alteration as well, in terms of what happens if free water gets into our load paths, right? So, for example, with a journal bearing, the two surfaces are separated predominantly by the base oil, and it's the base oil's viscosity which is giving us that separation. So it supports both hydrodynamic as well as elastohydrodynamic film thicknesses, right? But if we have free water in our system, right, then at some stage that free water is going to get to the load zone, and water just isn't able to support the same kind of load that oils are. That's why we don't use water as lubricants, right? Because otherwise they would be very, very cheap and plentiful. And we would love to use water as a lubricant, but it's not effective at protecting machine surfaces. So as a result, we get a collapse in that film thickness, and we get a whole bunch of excess wear, right? Which is obviously going to be damaging to all of our equipment. So the viscosity alteration is kind of two-pronged, right? If we get free water into the load zone, it collapses. And if we get emulsions in our system, that can lead to excess heat, excess energy, as well as oil starvation. Now, another problem with having water in your oil system is a process known as cavitation. So typically we associate cavitation with air bubbles, right? But in actual fact, what can happen is if you get think about where there are massive changes in pressure in your oil system. Typically where it occurs is at the pump, right? Because you're taking a liquid that is at low pressure on the suction side, and then you are charging it with very, very high pressure as it goes to the discharge side. So if you have a vapor bubble, which is created, then as you exert a whole bunch of pressure on it very, very quickly, you are going to collapse it and also vastly increase the temperature as well because of the ideal gases laws, right? So this is, that they've taken some high-speed camera images of what a collapsing water bubble actually looks like. And effectively what it does is the water bubble kind of implodes in on itself, and you get this almost like a supersonic jet, which is hitting the metal surface, and it will slowly over time, it will pit that metal surface. So if you've ever seen, cavitation on a propeller of a boat, for example, you will know what that looks like. And in your pump, you'll be able to recognize it by the sound. So it'll sound like someone has thrown marbles into your pump, into your oil pump. It will be a very, very unusual sound, and that will be an indication that you have cavitation, which will very quickly lead to all kinds of erosive wear. And another problem with having water in your oil system is the problem of rust, right, and corrosion. We know that water is kind of essential for creating rusting systems, right? So the presence of water can be really problematic. Now, just to get on to Mohammed's question, right, we're now going to address hydrolysis. Okay, if you want to create an ester, so any of the synthetic esters, for example, the way that you create it is you react an acid with an alcohol. Now, for example, among the aviation jet oils, so all of the turbines that are bolted to aircraft, they are polyol esters. So you're reacting, generally it's an acid that's derived from palm oils with a synthetic alcohol, and you get a polyol ester and you get some water. And then what you need to do is you need to dehydrate the water away, right, to leave yourself with just the ester. The problem is that if now an ester comes into contact with water, what we're actually doing is we're driving this reaction in reverse. So we're upsetting the equilibrium. And so an ester will actually break apart and it will form an acid and an alcohol, right? Now, that's undesirable because obviously that's raising the acidity of our oil. So our total acid number will go up. But not only that, acids promote even further corrosion, right? So the presence of water alone is going to potentially cause corrosion. But then if we include acids into that water phase, we're going to promote even more corrosion, right? So that's one example of a hydrolysis reaction. But hydrolysis doesn't just occur in esters. It occurs in all kinds of lubricants. So as an example, there are many additives which are basically metal salts. So the way that you create a salt is by reacting an acid and a base. So as an example, the most common anti-wear additive in the world is an additive called ZDDP. You may have heard of it just being called zinc, right? Its actual name is zinc dialkyl-dithiophosphate. And it's created by an acid-base reaction, right? It's the reaction of basically a thiophosphoric acid with a zinc oxide. And you get ZDDP, which is actually a metal salt. Well, what that means is that if we add water to ZDDP, we get a similar kind of reaction. It hydrolyzes and it wants to devolve back into its components. So I'm going to show you something which I think is a pretty cool bit of chemistry, to be honest. I know the audience here is more of a kind of industrial bent, but I want to show you what happens in engine oils when we expose zinc to water. This is a really important reaction, right? Because water is one of the most common contaminants and zinc is one of the most common additives. So we'd love to understand what happens when the two come into contact with each other. Okay, so let's say, for example, I have a ZDDP molecule and I'm able to react it with a decent amount of water. How would this happen? Well, obviously, we've already talked about some of the sources of water, but in an engine, if you got a coolant leak, for example, into your crankcase, that would be a prime case for where this would happen, right? Because obviously, most coolants are about 50% water and 50% glycol. Okay, so the water reaction with ZDDP is going to be that hydrolysis reaction. And it devolves into a number of different components, right? Chemistry here is a little bit complex, but let me just point out some things to you. All right, so on the screen here, in the bottom left and bottom right, that's H2S, right? Now, the problem with H2S, hydrogen sulfide, it's that rotten egg gas. When it oxidizes, H2S forms SO2, which oxidizes again to form SO3, which when mixed with water forms H2SO4, which is sulfuric acid, right? And as you can probably appreciate, it's not good to have sulfuric acid in your engine, right? It can do all sorts of damage to particularly, copper-based and lead-based crankcase bearings, as well as big and small end bearings, right? Not only that, but we have the formation of these alcohols, and alcohols tend to be slightly acidic as well. So we're adding more acids into the system. We've got a little bit of base with this zinc hydroxide, and then these molecules in the middle are called phosphoric acid. So again, more acids that we're creating, which are bad for our oil system. Now, the thing which is unique, just quickly, Mohammed has asked, can we say that hydrolysis is a water reaction with an other material? Generally, yeah. yeah, I guess that's probably true. So in an oil system, we just generally say hydrolysis reaction is what happens when water causes some kind of molecule to decompose, right? That was, hopefully that's a decent answer to that. Okay, now just going back to the engine oil. So we have all of these components, right? What is really unique about engine oils is that engine oils contain detergents, and they tend to be calcium or magnesium based. The calcium-based detergents, when they react with water, form calcium hydroxide, right? And when calcium hydroxide reacts with phosphoric acid, you get the production of something which is called calcium phosphate. Now, calcium phosphate forms crystals, right, which look like this. And I'd just love to see maybe in the chat box, does anyone know what this is, just by any chance? So far, no answers so far, but I'll give you a clue. The source for this picture comes from stonerelief.com. So what we've actually created is a kidney stone, right? So there are obviously many different types of kidney stones. I've heard that passing a kidney stone is one of the most excruciating experiences that you can ever have in your life. Like, it's on par with herniations. I hesitate to say childbirth because I have no experience of that, right? But I've heard it's unbelievably painful. And that's because they're so abrasive and they're so hard as well. And you are actually creating kidney stones in your engine as the result of the reaction of water with some of the additives in the lubricant system. So again, hopefully I'm impressing on you the fact that water is bad for your oil system. Not only that, but it can also cause disruptions in the way that the additives behave. So a lot of these surface acting additives, the whole purpose of them is that they're supposed to want to bind to contaminants. Now, you've got to remember, additives are dumb, right? They don't have a mind of their own. So the way that we get them to connect to something else is purely by polarity, right? We can't tell them to go to a specific place. So a contaminant comes in, it's typically polar. So these kind of detergents and corrosion inhibitors and all that kind of stuff will want to stick to something that's polar. Well, water is also polar. In fact, it's more polar than most of the contaminants. And so it can sometimes then attract all those additives, right, and sort of throw them off the scent. Now we're going to get into, like, how do we prevent water from getting into our, so we've established that water is terrible for our oil system. So how do we actually prevent it from getting in there? So number 2 poll question. And I've seen a couple of questions have also come through. So I'll address those too. So next poll question. Do you think that water can penetrate a sealed oil drum? I'm only going to give you 2 options, yes or no. And while that's being answered, Sharik has also asked the question, why there is a suction problem in pumps power pack. And I believe that that's probably related to our slide on cavitation. So why is there a suction problem? Do you think that water can penetrate a sealed oil drum? Vast majority say yes, and that's excellent, right? That's really good because it can, and we'll address that very, very soon. Okay, so just want to quickly address Sharik's question. We might have to get to this in the AMA. Why is there a suction problem in the pump's power pack? Also, maybe the question if I can rephrase that, is why is there water vapor on the suction side of the pump? That's a really good question. So where you could typically get that is if you lower the pressure, and that could be because of a restriction in the suction line. That's typically how it happens, or in very, very rare circumstances where you have a sealed headspace and you've managed to drop the pressure of that. That's pretty rare, but maybe we'll have to address that in the AMA session. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about water control strategies. So if you think about sources of contamination, we sort of have to think about what is the life of a lubricant. And it goes from manufacturing right down to when we use it in the application. Now, as an most of the people on this call are end users, right? And so you don't get much of a say in the manufacturing, packaging, and distribution. Where your kind of responsibility really kicks in is in storage through to using it in the application. So let's talk a little bit about storage. And this is when we talk about the drum. So the problem with oil drums is that they can't be airtight. And the reason for this is because you need to allow a bit of thermal expansion. So let's say, for example, I leave an oil drum outside and it's got some rain on it. There's some condensation. You can see there's some water on the lid of the drum. Now, if we have the sunrise, then the warm oil is going to heat up and it's going to expand, and it's going to expand more than the drum does. So it's got to force air out somehow, right? Otherwise, the lid would basically pop right off, right? Now, when this whole system cools down, then what's going to happen is now you're drawing a vacuum in the headspace, and that's going to cause that water to be drawn through the bunks, right? And so that's how water can get into sealed containers. So it's really important, even when we have, perfectly new oil, if we can do everything we can to store them, in a climate controlled environment with an air conditioner would be perfect, but that's not practical, right? So at the very least, if we can do it, indoors. All right. The other thing as well is about using desiccant breathers to prevent water from getting into the headspace. So this is just a very, very simple and cheap way of reducing the amount of water that ingresses into your oil system, right? So the way that these typically work is that, obviously, so if I can highlight it here, so humid air is coming through, right? The desiccant is exactly the same as like that silica gel that you often find in food packets. And it is what, hygroscopic. It likes to take on water. And as the air passes through, it gets dried, and then dry air goes into the headspace. Now, unfortunately, some of these breathers are built such that they actually dry the air coming out as well. And that's going to mean that you use up the desiccant at twice the rate that you need to. In reality, what you want is a one-way valve that would mean that the air that's exiting, you don't care if the air that's exiting is wet, right? You want it actually to bypass the desiccant. So that's one thing to look at when you're purchasing these. All right. So we've already talked about water ingress prevention. One of the other ways that we can sort of get rid of water is by trying to coalesce all the water droplets, right? Now, this rather complex equation that I've got up on the screen is how fast does a water droplet fall when it's in oil? So this is called the Stokes equation, and you can use it to calculate, the speed of a metal ball, for example, dropping in a cylinder full of oil. So it's dependent on the density of the water and the density of the oil, the viscosity of the oil, gravity, because that's the thing that's pulling it down, as well as the radius, right, of the water droplet. So if I can increase the radius of the water droplet, it's going to fall faster. It's going to separate out faster. And so we have a bunch of coalescing methods, right, which are designed to coalesce all the water together. Now, the other way that we can do it, which is a little bit cheeky, is that we can also increase the gravity term, right? You might think, well, that doesn't make any sense. How can you increase gravity? But that's how centrifuging works, right? So we can have a centrifuging filter, which is designed basically to increase the rate of acceleration, right? And as a result, the water will separate out much faster. So that's another method that we can use for removing that. Okay, absorption of water. So, just regular cellulose, which is to say paper-based filters, can actually absorb a small amount of water. I wouldn't want it to take on, thousands of parts per million. But, just as if you leave wood out in the elements, it will warp and it will expand. And that's because timber, which is also made of cellulose, is hygroscopic. It takes water out of the atmosphere. Or cellulose media filters will do exactly the same thing, right? They'll tend to take on water. There are also some like super absorbent filters that can help remove water as well. So that's something to look at. And one of the final ways, which is probably the more expensive, but very, very useful for high volumes of water, is those boiling point methods, which is basically vacuum dehydration, right? So what we're doing is, as the atmospheric pressure reduces, the boiling point of water also reduces. So the idea is that if we can create a vacuum in this headspace here, then we can reduce the boiling point of water down to, let's say, for example, 60 degrees Celsius or something like that. And then we only need to heat up the oil to around 60 degrees Celsius, and then the water will effectively boil off. Right? Now, these are obviously going to require a little bit more maintenance, because now you have a pump, which is, under a fair bit of negative pressure, but, can be worth your while if you're trying to remove a lot of water at one time. All right. So Amos is asking about foaming in a lubrication tank. So we're going to talk about foam now, right? Because one of the other negative effects of water, it sort of seems a little bit counterintuitive, but is actually foam formation. So let's talk a little bit about the types of air. So we already talked about the types of water in oil. Now let's talk about the types of air. So just like that there was dissolved water in oil systems, we also have dissolved air. You can't see it, it's not apparent, but it's there. And in a mineral oil, my understanding is that, around 7% of the volume is probably actually dissolved air. In something like a polyalpha olefin, it's probably lower, around like 2% or something like that. So that's dissolved air. Not much you can do about that, because the amount of dissolved air is more or less determined by the atmospheric pressure. All right. Then there's entrained air. Entrained air is held within the body of the lubricant. So we have little bubbles in the body of the lubricant, and you can, if you ever drank a Coke or a beer or anything like that, those micro bubbles that are in the liquid, you would call that entrained air. Then we've got foam, right, which sits on the surface of the tank. That's kind of like the difference with foam. And then, of course, there is another type of air which is often neglected, which is free air, right, which is the actual headspace itself. So four different types of air. And the poll question that I'd love to ask you guys is, which do you think is the most dangerous form of air for your equipment? And I've got four options here with the four types of air, which is free air, dissolved air, foam, and entrained air. And we'll give you a little bit of time to answer. Now, I noticed that in the Q&A box, Pradeep has also put in a comment that online filtration machines will help us keep us on track. And that is true. Where at all possible, if you can use filtration, right? I know there are plenty of places which are not using any kind of filtration at all. But like I said, even cellulose-based filters that you would be using to pick up particles, they can actually pick up a fair bit of, like a small amount of water as well. So that can help with controlling the amount of water. All right, we have some answers. That's interesting. Okay, so foam is the leader with 49%, and dissolved air second, 26%, and entrained air at 21%. Now, I'm going to go through the reasons. I think foam and entrained air could both be the correct answer to this question, just to be clear. But the difference is that foam is actually necessary for the functioning of an oil system, right? So in some cases, foam can be beneficial. I can't think of any cases where entrained air is beneficial, right? So let's talk about that a little bit more. All right, so let's talk about foam formation and when that's a problem. So foam formation can typically be a problem from a safety perspective, right? If we have foam that's actually spilling out, right? Now we have oil on the floor. That's a safety hazard in terms of slips, trips, and falls, right? Obviously, oil is very slick. That's the whole point of oil. So that is undesirable. It also gives us a lot of difficulty when we're trying to control the oil level, either in the application or in the reservoir, right? So if you're looking through a sight glass and there's a lot of foam, often you can't tell where the oil level is, and that can become a problem. Similarly, let's say, for example, in a gearbox, typically you want the oil level, let's say, for example, half to 2/3 of the way up the teeth. And if you're unable to see that because of the high amount of foaming that has occurred, then we may be either over or under lubricating our system. And so that can be a problem as well. Another major problem is air locks. So what does this mean? It basically means that in an airline, typically where you have like a bend or a high spot, you'll get the foam migrating to the high spot. And the reduction, you can think of air as being like a restriction. It's almost like an orifice. And so where that restriction happens, there's a big pressure drop. And if the pressure drops so much that you end up with negative pressure at, let's say, for example, the suction side of the pump. Now the pump runs dry. And that can also be a massive problem because now you starve your application of oil as well. Right? So that can be a major problem. And finally, simply the loss of lubricating film. So if you get foam and it gets sucked into, let's say, for example, the mating surfaces of the gears on like the gear teeth, that can also become a problem, right? So that's all the instances where foam is bad. But let's quickly talk about how foam happens, right? So, what governs whether a bubble will form or will not, right? And it's all about surface tension. So, for example, if you have tried to blow a bubble with just water, and you're trying this either when you were a kid or you're trying to do it with a kid, preferably a kid you will know that blowing bubbles with water is a good way to make a kid upset, right? Because nothing will happen. Similarly, if you try to do it with oil, I don't know if anyone has ever tried this, it's almost impossible to blow bubbles with oil, right? Correctly formulated mineral oils and particularly polyalpha olefins, which are very, very nonpolar, display almost no foaming tendency, right? And that's why, polyalpha olefins are very, very popular in formulations for example, gear oils or wind turbine gear oils, right? Because they're very, very, very low foaming tendency. Now, as you go up, right, in polarity, what you're doing is you're increasing the surface tension. And I could do a whole nother hour on how surface tension works. But basically, what for our purposes, water has kind of too much surface tension, right? You can think of trying to blow a bubble with water. It's almost like in material science, you would describe it as being a brittle fracture, right? It's the film is so tight that when you try and put any air through it, it just snaps. Oils, on the other hand, have too little surface tension, which means that the bubble film is too thin and it can't support the amount of pressure that you're blowing through it, and so it breaks, right? There is this kind of Goldilocks zone where we can create stable foam, which is in between water and a mineral oil. And that's one of the reasons why water ingress into your oil system can lead to a foaming problem, because water, if you have water in your oil system, it's raising the polarity of the overall oil system and it can get you into that stable foam level, right? So now we can generate stable foam. The other thing that can do it as well is either soaps or polar contaminants. So where do polar contaminants come from? Oxidation, dust, contamination, all kinds of contaminants are polar and therefore can create foaming problems. So often when you see a foaming problem, it is the result of contamination. Soap, you might think, how do you get a soap into my oil system? Well, obviously, grease thickeners are typically soaps. So if you have any amount of grease contamination in your oil system, that's likely to cause a foaming problem as well. And typically where this happens is when people are using grease to seal gaskets and things like that, right? And a little bit of grease ends up in the reservoir. Now I have a foaming problem, right? And that's because people aren't aware that grease has a soap and soap results in foam. So that's the problem with foam formation. Now let's briefly talk about the dangers of entrained air. Now, if I have a lot of entrained air, it can lead to pump cavitation, right? Because now I have an air bubble which is traveling to the pump, and that air bubble is going to get rapidly compressed. That's the perfect conditions for creating cavitation. I also get erratic operation and loss of precision control. So let's say, for example, if I have a hydraulic system, the whole point of a hydraulic system is that we are using the fact that fluid is incompressible, right? So we can transfer power from one location to another location using the fluid. Well, air, if it gets in, is very compressible. So you can imagine if you're pushing on a syringe and there's lots of air in it, it's very spongy, right? So you're not transferring that power correctly. Oxidation, right? This is kind of obvious. Oxidation is produced as a result of heat as well as exposure to oxygen. The more air you have in your oil system, the more oxygen. It can lead to vibration through cavitation, low oil pressure switch trips, right? As well as reduced viscosity. Okay, so lots of problems with entrained air as well. Okay, now let's talk about how do we try and prevent air from getting into our system. The first way is to eliminate sources of air. When you look around at kind of a generic oil system, where does air come from? Well, let's say, for example, if the fluid level is too low and I start sucking foam into the pump, right? That's a problem, right? That's where I'm drawing air in. Otherwise, typically it has to come from some kind of leaking seal. Maybe, the gasket's not fitted correctly at the flange. Maybe there's something going on at the valve. Typically, the filter housings are airtight, but maybe the seal here on the filter is not completely done. So that's where we can kind of suck air into the system. But the most obvious way that it happens is generally in the application itself. So if you think about a gearbox, especially one which is splash lubricated or mislubricated or something like that, as the gears are turning, they're churning all that oil around the gearbox. It's sloshing and it's creating lots of air. The other place that we can often get it, hang on a sec, I need to sneeze. Sorry about that, but that was going to be very loud if I did it in the microphone. So that can generate a lot of air, but also as we dump oil back into the reservoir, if the exit point, right, for our returns line is way above the oil level, then I've created a waterfall, right? And I'm going to generate a lot of air and foam. So trying to look at all these locations, right, for ingress of air is often important in trying to troubleshoot where is the air coming from in the first place. All right. Now we're getting on to the point of where I'm going to show you where foam is necessary and is actually good for our oil system. So we know, for example, that entrained air is bad, right? Because if it gets into pumps, it's bad. It can reduce the viscosity, that's bad. You can, same with water, it'll collapse. Lubricant films, that's also bad. So we need to remove entrained air. Well, practically, the only way that we can really remove entrained air is to have it rise to the surface, become foam, and then have that foam break, right? So the key is it needs to become foam, but the foam needs to be unstable, right? So that's what we want. And with basically the opposite of what we talked about in water bubbles, the opposite is true in air, in that larger bubbles rise faster instead of fall faster. So what we ideally want is, instead of lots of little micro bubbles, we want those micro bubbles to kind of coalesce together and form large bubbles that can then rise to the surface where they can then pop, right? So in that respect, foam is kind of desirable. So I get some customers coming to me saying that I have foam in my gearbox, or sorry, in my reservoir. I need to do something about it. The first thing I would caution is, how much foam is there? Is the foam stable or not, right? That's really the questions you need to be asking. Foam itself, not necessarily a bad question, not necessarily a bad problem. The stable foam is a problem. So as a rule of thumb, if you can take your oil, put it in a bottle, and shake up the bottle, the foam should dissipate, right, within 10, 20 minutes, something like that, right? If it stays around, then potentially you have a problem, right? All right, so the next poll question, this is the final poll question for the webinar. I'd love to ask, have you ever been advised to treat foaming issues with aftermarket additives? And again, there's only really two options here. The answers are yes or no. All right. Last of the answers in. And the results are pretty close to 50-50, maybe sort of 60-40. So most people are saying yes, right? The advice has been to treat with like a pour-in anti-foam additive. And typically, these will be, silicon-based. You'll often hear about silicon anti-foam additives. We're going to talk about those in a second. So there is some caution that I'll advise about those. So let's talk about that in a second. All right. If I want to remove entrained air, there's a number of strategies, right? So remember, I've got a whole bunch of air bubbles and I want them to coalesce. So one of the ways that we can do that is putting in sort of like baffle plates, right? Baffle plates will cause, it's basically like a nucleation site for the growth of air bubbles. And as they grow, sometimes they'll connect together. And then obviously the larger bubbles will then rise faster. So that's one way that we can do it. The other way that we can do it is just to increase the residence time, right, in the actual reservoir itself. So often, if we have a foaming problem, it could be, if you have a foaming problem from the very beginning and it persists, no matter what oil you put in or anything like that, sometimes it's just a problem with the reservoir design, that it's not large enough to allow the oil sufficient time to let go of all of its air, right? It needs that time. All right. The other thing that can happen as well with foam formation is that the design of the tank might actually be wrong. So typically when you think about oil tanks, most of them are quite wide. They're not very tall, right? And one of the major reasons for that is the problem of trying to get the foam to break. Because if you think about it, if I have a tall and narrow reservoir, this is the same amount of foam, right? When I shifted between slides here, there's the same number of air bubbles, but I have ostensibly more foam, right? And so that's a problem with the design of the tank. If it's tall and narrow, there's less opportunity for foam bubbles at the top to sort of break and let the air into the headspace. All right, so now let's quickly talk about anti-foam additives. So how are anti-foam additives designed? Well, basically, the whole point of them is that they should migrate to an air-oil interface. And where we want them to do that is at foam, right? So you'll have these typically silicon-based molecules, which will go to an air bubble. And what they'll do is they'll reduce the surface tension such that bubble will start to thin out. And when it gets thin enough, it can't support the pressure inside, and so the bubble pops, right? That's the way that they work. Now, silicon anti-foam additives typically look like this, right? So it's silicons and oxygens, and it's just a long chain of them. Now, there's a couple of problems with these. First of all, their size, right? Typically, a molecule of these will be in the order of about 10 to 40 micron. That's pretty large for an additive, and it also means that they tend to be susceptible to being filtered out by filters because, often with your filtration, you're trying to capture particles which are smaller than 40 micron. So sometimes these can get picked up by filters. So that's problem number one. Maybe the reason you have a foaming problem is because your filtration is too tight and you've actually removed all the anti-foam additives, right, from the system. The other issue, and this is where I'm going to talk briefly about the aftermarket additives, the way that you manufacture these is a very, very closely controlled process in a manufacturing plant. The reason is because these silicon anti-foam additives are not oil soluble. So you basically have to grow these in sort of like a nucleation, and you grow the particle in a carrier fluid, and you have to very, very evenly mix it and disperse it into the oil to make sure that it's all held in and dispersed evenly. So you get a single homogeneous batch. That is very difficult to manage in the field, right? So if you're just pouring in a bunch of silicon anti-foam additives, you're not going to get that level of control that we typically do when we're actually manufacturing these products. And so that can be a little bit dangerous, right? And the reason it can be dangerous is because these anti-foam additives, like I said, what they want to do is they want to bind to an air-oil interface. Now, again, going back to my earlier statement, additives are dumb. They don't know what they're doing. So if we design them to look for an air-oil interface, they'll go to any air-oil interface. They can't tell the difference between entrained air and foam. So if a silicon polymer attaches itself to entrained air, the problem with that is now I'm weighing that air bubble down. It wants to rise to the surface and become foam and break and release air, but now it doesn't want to, right? Because it's got this silicon polymer hanging onto it, keeping it down. So that is the danger, is that you can actually, by over-treating your system with silicon anti-foam additives, you can actually increase the amount of entrained air in the system. The final risk that I'd also like to point out, which can cause a decent amount of foaming, is also contaminants. polar contaminants can sometimes attract the anti-foam additives, right? And as a result, you now have nothing that can break the foam. So I think I'm just about out of time right now. And unfortunately, that is actually the last slide. I really appreciate everyone taking the time, obviously, to listen to this talk. Hopefully, you got some value out of it. If you have any questions, I'd love to address them in the Ask Me Anything session. And so for the moment, I'll just hand back over to the Minimac team.
Hello. Yeah. Hello. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Supreme, and it feels good to be back in Minimac webinar. And thank you for being a patient audience. We are about to start our Q&A session. Before starting our Q&A session, I would like to announce our upcoming webinar, which is Ask Me Anything about oil filtration and oil reclamation. The webinar will be on 21st of July, 6:30 p.m. IST. You can find the registration link in the chat box. So my teammate would just share the registration link in the chat box right now. And you can register from the registration link and be a part of the webinar. Make sure you register before the seats run out, because it's a limited seat webinar, it will be an open session to ask lubrication experts all the questions and doubts that you have, and they'll answer your queries live on our webinar. So moving ahead to the Q&A round, I would like to ask Mr. Anshuman Agarwal to turn on his camera. Yeah. So yeah, moving ahead to our Q&A round here. So the first question is from Mr. Mohammad Reza, and his question is, what is the difference between foaming characteristics and air release? So I would like to pass this question to Mr. Rafe.
Yeah, great question. Great question. So foam and air release are obviously sort of two different sides of the coin, right? So let's think about the process, right, of getting rid of air. So you've got foaming, which is I churn up the oil and I generate a whole bunch of foam. Some oils will, if I take two oils and I apply the same mixing to them, one will often create more foam than the other. And so that's, in ballpark terms, that's what we would describe as foaming tendency, is how much foam does this oil want to produce, right? That's typically dependent on, the type of base oil that you're using, right? Some, let's say, for example, like I said before, polyalpha olefins have very, very low foaming tendency because they're almost completely non-polar. Whereas mineral oils will foam a little bit more, and more polar oils will foam even more than that, right? So that's kind of like foam tendency. And then the air release is almost like, well, how fast does that foam break, right? So once I've established the foam, I've got to release all that air, right? And so again, different oils have a different capacity to do that.
Okay, I hope the question got answered rightly. And moving on to our next question. Next question is from Mr. Pradeep Prabhu. He's asking, why will someone use grease as a sealant? Mr. Rafe, again, this question for you.
Why would someone use? Okay. This is related to when I commented that people are using grease to seal. Let's say, for example, like the hatch, right? Why are people doing it? That's a great question. I am not entirely sure, because it's not best practice, right? But if let's be realistic, right? The way that things are done in the field is not always the right way, right? So often, maybe a tech doesn't have the right gasket for something, and rather than, shutting everything down or saying we'll come back and we'll do it another day. They often just get it, tub of grease, wipe it around, put the flange together, and say that'll be good enough, right? And the theory is that the grease can sufficiently seal. Now, it probably is a pretty effective sealant, to be honest. It probably will do the job, right? The whole reason we use greases instead of oils a lot of the time is because it can exclude contaminants, right? It has that sort of solid property to it. It's a semi-solid. But then you risk grease contamination of the lubricant.
Okay, moving on to our next question. Next question is from Mr. Preston Thompson. He wants to know, can O-ring grease contribute to foaming?
Okay, so I'm not as familiar with Molykote, to be honest. So can O-ring grease contribute to foaming? So generally, I'd say that the things that are going to contribute to foam most is pretty much anything that's polar, right, will contribute to foam formation. And generally, that is most additives, to be honest, as well as a lot of seal materials as well. And in a weird way, some silicon contaminants can also cause a problem as well. So I don't know the specifics of Molykote, to be honest, but I'd say probably yes.
Okay, do you think zinc would contribute to foam formation?
Sorry, what was that, Anshuman?
Do you think zinc would contribute to the foam formation? Zinc.
Oh, yeah, yes, yeah. So in that respect, typically anti-wear and EP containing oils tend to foam more than their, let's say, R&O cousins, right?
Yeah.
Again, because most of those additives are designed to be surface acting. They're designed to bind to surfaces, which means that they're all polar. And again, they're increasing that surface tension of the oil. So, in an ideal world, if you wanted to create an oil which had almost no foaming characteristics whatsoever, you would basically design a straight metallocene PAO, which is almost just all straight carbon chains, right? There's no polarity to it. It doesn't like to bind with air. It doesn't like to form foam at all. And so that foam will break really, really quickly.
So with that, do you think the synthetic fluids would have lesser foam tendency?
Sorry, were you asking that question to me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Just wanted to check. I want to caution here when I say synthetic fluids have lower foaming tendency, right? Because there's always caveats. In general, synthetic polyalpha olefins have lower foaming tendency. Yes. Right. But of course, there are 1,000 types of synthetic on the market, right? So, esters, for example, tend to foam a little bit more than their mineral oil cousins. So I want to caution around there. And then the reason I also want to caution about that is because often where you will see a synthetic oil is in, for example, in a gear application, where it will also then be loaded up with EP additives and an ester co-base as well. And so that will change the surface tension properties of the lubricant.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So moving on to our next question. Our next question is from Mr. Narendran. He has asked, doesn't excessive additives in the oil that occurs during top-up create foam in the oil?
Okay. Oh, I see what you mean. So just to maybe rephrase the question a little bit. So what Narendran is saying is, as you're topping up oil, if you're not also taking away, if you're not doing a drain and fill, right, where you bleed off, let's say 200 mils, and you add in 200 mils. If you're only adding in 200 mils, then theoretically you're increasing the concentration of additives that are in the system. So not only are there spent additives that are flowing around your oil system, you're also topping up with more additives. And so in that respect, yes, yep, that is true. So generally, the more additization there is in an oil, the more likely it is to foam. That's definitely true. However, I would say that probably what is the more predominant factor in the foaming tendency, rather than the small amount of additional additive that you're putting in, it's probably more likely that the level of oxidation that has occurred in the oil, as well as the level of contamination that has occurred in the oil, is probably going to have a larger effect than the small amount of additives on top up.
Okay. So moving on to our next question. It's a bit long question, so I would like to break it into two questions. So it's from Mr. Rafael. He has asked, the ASTM for foaming characteristics in lubricating oil is enough to evaluate the anti-foaming additives performance. So he wants to know if...
Good question. Okay, so there's two different ways to answer this, right? There's in the formulation or in the field, right? So if you are formulating a lubricant, then generally the ASTM foaming characteristics is probably what you're going to use as your benchmark for what is the correct amount of foaming tendency, right? So yes, I would say that they are sufficient. If you're in the field, on the other hand, I would argue that you don't need the ASTM foaming characteristics. You just need your eyes, right? So people often ask, do I have a foam problem? That's what they ask me. And I generally say, well, why don't you go and have a look, right? If you have a foam problem in your reservoir, then you have a foam problem, if that makes sense, right? Because the ASTM foaming characteristics could be off the charts, but if you have no foam in your oil system, then it's no problem, right? That means that your reservoir is adequately sized such that whatever foam was produced has since broken and has released all that air, right? So that's why I would caution around relying on the ASTM tests too much.
Okay. So our next question is from Mr. Tiwari. He wants to know if overfiltration of oil is bad.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Great question. Great question. So it's almost like too much of a good thing, right? And in this respect, yes, right. And when we say overfiltration, I think we should be a little bit more precise with our language, right? I can see that my video is frozen, but I am still here. So I would want to caution against saying overfiltration as opposed to the wrong type of filtration, right? Because just having more filtration, but more of the correct filtration is usually a good thing. But if you are, let's say, for example, you have applied filtration which is too fine, and now you're starting to remove additives. Well, now that is the wrong kind of filtration, right? If you, for example, are overusing vacuum dehydration, right? So the danger with vacuum dehydration, very, very effective way of removing water. But I have seen some systems which are not well maintained and they have very, very low vacuum, which means that they need to heat the oil to like 75, 80 degrees Celsius in order to get the water to boil off. Well, if you're heating the oil to 70 or 80 degrees, now you're running into an oxidation problem, right? So that's where I would caution around just saying overfiltration is bad. It's a lot of the wrong type of filtration is bad.
Okay. So moving on to our next question. Our next question is from Mr. Lavani. Can we increase the TPN of our lube oil as an aftermarket solution to increase the drain time of lube oil in our equipment?
Yeah. So there's two ways of doing this. First is like we talked about before, is called like oil sweetening, where you just drain off an amount of oil, put in some new oil that's going to refresh with some new TBN. And so you are artificially kind of increasing the TBN as you go. So that's one way of doing it. The other way is, as you said, to use aftermarket solutions like pour in TBN additives. Again, that can be done, right? There's nothing wrong with aftermarket additives. But again, I would put some caution into it in, have you tested that that's going to be appropriate for the application, right? Because there are different types of TBN molecules. So for example, some are calcium-based, some are magnesium-based. And in the automotive world, the calcium-based detergents are associated with a phenomenon called LSPI, which is a low-speed pre-ignition, which is almost like a detonation effect. So if you have a magnesium-based oil system and you start adding calcium, maybe you're going to produce a problem that you hadn't encountered before. So I would say, yes, you can do it, but with some cautions, check it with, your engine OEM as well as your, as well as the oil supplier as well, to check that for compatibility issues.
Okay. Moving up next, Mr. Shahnawaz Kareem wants to know something about non-silicon based anti-foam additives.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So yeah, I guess I should have probably touched on this in the presentation, but sort of ran out of time. So there are really two families of anti-foam additives, right? One of them is the silicon-based ones, which I already talked about, and then the other is a family which you'll either see referred to as PMAs, which stands for polymethacrylates, right? Which is kind of a polymer-based anti-foam additive. So they kind of work a little bit differently. I can't say that I know as much about the polymethacrylates. They tend to be used a little bit more in industrial lubricants rather than engine oils. And they seem to be, I would say, from my understanding, is that they are less effective at breaking foam, but more effective in allowing entrained air to be released. That's my understanding, but I'm by no means an expert.
Okay. So the next question, I would like to pass it to Mr. Anshuman Agarwal, and I would like to also rephrase this question. So Mr. A.S. wants to know, how are Minimac filtration machines different from the other brands present in the market?
So basically, there are multiple brands, not just the two which are mentioned by the audience. There are multiple brands of oil purification systems which are available now, and at the same time, there are multiple technologies which are available for the purification activity, depending upon what kind of contaminant you have to remove or separate from your lubricating system. And hence, you need to go to the right company who can offer you a versatile solution, and who can offer you a solution which comes out from a kitty of technologies based on various requirements and based on various applications and compatibility. So while you do inquire at Minimac Systems, you get a host of technologies for working on low vacuum dehydration, on coalescers, and on centrifuging, and also water absorption. At the same time, when you talk about solid particle separation, you get technologies like mechanical stage-wise filtration, you get electrostatic separation, and you get centrifuging. So basically, it's dependent upon the kind of technologies that one offers to you based on the application, based on the requirements that the client is having. And that's the reason why Minimac can offer you specific customized solutions to all your needs.
Okay. So our team has just pasted the link for our oil purification range in the chat box. So you can just check the range of oil purification machines that we have. Moving ahead, the next question is again from Mr. Rafael. He wants to know that additives with polar or non-polar parts, such as detergents, dispersants, and corrosion inhibitors, can act as emulsifiers in water contaminated oil.
Yeah, that's a great pickup. So what I was trying to demonstrate with that mayonnaise example, right, is that cholesterol with the polar head and a non-polar tail looks very much like all of our surfactants. So, some detergents, dispersants, corrosion inhibitors, anti-wear additives, EP additives, a lot of them have that kind of form to them, which means that they're all going to bridge the gap between water and oil and help stabilize emulsions. So that's why, when you're formulating a lubricant, you know, people talk about like a balanced formulation. You don't want to just throw as much EP in as possible because, okay, you will protect the gearbox, but you are going to run into things like emulsion problems.
Okay. The next question is from Mr. Pradeep. If foaming persists in a gearbox, is it advisable to run? And secondly, if yes, till what timeline we can run the gearbox?
Yeah, this is one of those questions where it's unfortunately a bit of a like it depends and very, very specific to the scenario, right? So one of the things, for example, might depend on like what is the oil level. You could have a whole bunch of foam in the gearbox, but if you can maintain oil level control, maybe the amount of foam that's in the gearbox is okay, right? There is always going to be some amount of foam, right? Just to put that disclaimer out there. It might be small, it might be large. There's always going to be some amount. So then we have to ask the question, is it advisable to run? So what you really need to ask is, are there negative consequences of the foam in the gearbox? And that's really hard to make a blanket statement. So in general, right, we would say foam isn't good because if the foam gets into, in between the gear teeth, then it's going to collapse the oil film and cause the teeth to like basically scuff against each other. So it's unadvisable to run it in that condition. On the other hand, maybe you can use some condition monitoring techniques to get an idea of, is the gearbox functioning correctly, right? So, for example, if you were able to do vibration analysis and demonstrate that the gearbox is running as it was, the last time you did vibration analysis, maybe the gearbox is okay. And you'll be able to kind of continue to run it until you have the opportunity to do an oil change, right? Now, I should say, just while we're on the topic, when we're doing oil changes, I know that we've talked about flushing in this webinar series before. Remember, contaminants are one of the key components of producing stable foam. So if you have a lot of contaminants in your oil system and you have a foaming problem and you just change the oil without flushing, if there's residual contaminants in the system, you'll return to having a foaming problem, right? So you have to make sure that you are recharging a clean oil system in order to avoid that foaming problem again.
Okay. Moving up next, I see there are a lot of questions here and we are a bit short on time right now. So I will just pick a few questions and don't worry, you can ask all your questions in our upcoming webinar, which is only for asking questions about oil filtration and oil reclamation. So I'll just move on to the next question. Next question I'll pick is from Mr. Alex. He wants to know, can a shelf life and storage of lubricant trigger foaming?
Great question. So in some respects, yes. So remember I talked about those silicon antifoam additives and I said that they're not oil soluble. They're not oil soluble, sorry. They are kind of dispersed in this carrier fluid. Because they're not oil soluble, if you leave something on a shelf for a very, very long period of time, some of those silicon antifoam additives can actually settle out, right? And so if you're just taking some volume from the very top of the drum, maybe it doesn't have that kind of volume in it. So where at all possible, if you can kind of stir it up beforehand to try and disperse those silicon antifoam additives throughout the system, that's preferable, right? So generally shelf life is not a problem, but in the case of silicon antifoam additives, sometimes it can be.
Okay. Moving to our next question. Our next question is from Mr. Brahim. He wants to know when foaming test is advised and is it tested for oil types, for different oil types?
So the foaming test stays basically the same for all the different oil types. And okay, a couple of instances when you'll do it. First of all, sometimes it's included as part of your regular oil analysis testing, right? So you'll just get the results as they come. The other time to maybe do it is if you think you have a foaming problem, right? Sorry, third time that you might want to do it is actually when you're evaluating different lubricants as part of a procurement strategy, right? If you have a lot of foaming issues on site and you are choosing between 4 different brands of gear oils, maybe you want to understand the foaming tendency characteristics of each of those gear oils, right? So that's another instance where you might want to take some samples and send them off for analysis.
Okay. So moving on to our next question. Our next question is from Mr. Austin. He wants you to kindly outline some of the best methods of oil storage that is in line with best practices.
So there's so much to cover here, and that's probably its own topic. But
Exactly.
just as a very, very kind of basic level, you want to keep your lubricant cool, clean, dry, right? If you can do that, that's like 90% of the problem. So generally, if you can store indoors in sealed containers, and when you're doing transfers, you can do it in clean containers, that's 90% of the problem.
Okay. So to our next question, this will be the second last question of the evening. Our next question is from Mr. Tiwari. In case of emulsified mineral oils, when centrifuge is not successful, what to do? Is increasing temperature useful? I would like to pass this question to Mr. Anshuman Agarwal.
So very well said. When the oil is emulsified, the centrifuge can't be of any help because that's not a technology which is meant to remove the emulsified content of water or moisture. And the centrifuges, they are good only when the water is in free form. As soon as the water enters the emulsification stage or phase, centrifuging is not at all successful. The first question, I hope, is answered well. But the second question, is increasing the temperature useful, is actually troubling me a lot. Increasing the temperature, as Rafe also mentioned, in any circumstances is very, very harmful. You should never go beyond the recommended temperature range of operation of your lubricating oil. That's around 50 degrees centigrade, or in worst scenario, 60 degrees centigrade. But when the oil is emulsified and it is known to you, and if you are increasing the temperature, it's actually going to oxidize the oil completely in the presence of water, and it would lead to many more damages, which probably are irreparable. For example, one of them is acid formation and sludge formation and varnish formation in the oil. The answer to the solution of emulsification of mineral oil lies in 2 technologies. One is coalescer-based technology, which might work if the emulsification is not very high. But if in case the emulsification is in the very high range, where the oil color also has changed to pale yellow or white, the only left out technology is low vacuum dehydration, to my knowledge. No other technology in the world can handle the emulsified mineral oil, to our knowledge as of now.
Okay, so moving on to our last question of the evening. It's from Mr. Ajay Khetarpal. He wants to know any specific aspects need to be taken care of for long used oils other than the usual parameters, and any additive supplements required for time to time for mineral oil.
Great question. All right. So again, this is one that has many, many answers to it, right? So for example, it's very, very dependent on the type of lubricant and the application. So as an example, right? Look at wind turbine gear oils now. A lot of companies are now offering 10-year warranties on the lubricant. And there are very, very few opportunities for intervention in a wind turbine because often they're offshore, remote locations, very, very, very high up the tower, very difficult to do an oil change or anything like that. So in those instances, you're basically doing nothing to the oil system for 10 years. No additization, obviously filtration, but that's more or less it. And the oil companies now will guarantee 10-year life on those oil systems. On the other hand, you have engine oils, which are basically designed to be changed frequently, right? So dispersants, for example, are supposed to bind to soot contaminants. They don't do anything with them. They basically just drop them to the bottom of the sump until you do an oil change, and then that stuff comes out of the system. So unfortunately, there's no real good answer. When you do have an oil which you intend on using for a very long time, so maybe you have a high quality, synthetic or something, then I would say that the key there is reducing contamination, because the whole reason you bought the oil is for its long life, for its oxidation stability, its low foaming tendency, all that kind of stuff. But the way that you will ruin a high quality lubricant is through contaminating it. Because if you get contaminants into the oil, then that may necessitate an oil change. And all that money that you spent on a long life oil will now be for nothing. So I would say, yeah, if you are investing in some very high quality long life lubricants, then contamination control is the number one thing that you can do to prolong the life.
All right. So we are now out of time for our Q&A round. And seeing the number of questions, I would like to invite everyone right here to our next webinar, which is Ask Me Anything about oil filtration and oil reclamation. The registration link would be shared in the chat box. You can register from the link here. And we have also created a community on WhatsApp, which is Lube Talk. So it's a community of lubrication professionals all over the globe. And it is helpful and beneficial, as many technical articles and case studies are shared there weekly and on daily basis. And I would also like everyone to subscribe to Mr. Rafe's YouTube channel, which is Lubrication Explained on YouTube. You can have the link on the chat box. And that's it for tonight. Thank you everyone for joining and being a patient audience. Thank you, Mr. Anshuman Agrawal. Thank you, Mr. Rafe, for an amazing session on foam formation and water contamination and how to combat it. So that's it. Signing off from the Minimac team.
Thank you so much. Bye.